Thank you very much for attending our seminar today. My name is Devetta Thatcher, and I am a Senior Project Manager at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. NYSERDA is a government entity which helps provide energy efficiency services to the ratepayers of the investor-owned utilities. Let me just tell you that NYSERDA has provided incentives for the past 4 years for the installation of a technology called combined heat and power, which is on-site generation of electric at your facility. The byproduct heat that would be just vented to the atmosphere for a utility power plant in a combined heat and power system where you're making it at your site, you are able to capture that and put it to useful purposes. Most often in a multifamily resident, you are using it to preheat your domestic hot water that comes in from the city, thereby allowing your boiler to work less hard. So when we start here, Jim will talk to you a little bit more about the benefits of combined heat and power. The way NYSERDA's programs have worked is we have a group of pre-approved vendors of this technology. I want to give a shout out and a recognition to 2 of the vendors that have done the most installations in the multifamily market here in New York City. Aegis Energy Services, Dan, if you'd like to stand up, and Tecogen, and if Jeff will stand up. Both of their companies are exhibiting here at the Cooperator today. That's Aegis and Tecogen. A third of our vendors is Dual Fuel Corp. They are also exhibiting here today. They're down on the lower level, closer to where Aegis is. NYSERDA has a commitment to this technology. As we move into 2019, we're going to be submitting an investment plan to the public service for additional funding. Right now we are funded very, very well. Almost $100 million has been spent towards the installation of these combined heat and power systems in New York over the last 4 or 5 years. It's a program that we have run now for over 20 years. This is not a newfangled new technology. Henry Ford came up with the internal combustion engine many years ago. It is tested on the ground. It is also tested in the air with the microturbines. They are like what we have in airplanes. So these are not new technologies. They are technologies that are used in the multifamily market all over the United States, all over the world, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today to hear about them. I'm going to introduce now Jim Paul from ERS. ERS is the Outreach and Technical Services Contractor who provides technical assistance to buildings for anyone looking to explore combined heat and power. So if you are a board member and would like to have someone from ERS come in and speak to your board, we can make that happen on the state's dime. We will pay for that service. They will do a study of your building, a quick analysis to see if your building is a good fit for combined heat and power technology, and I'll let Jim now take over and tell you more. Thanks, Jim.
Good. Thank you, Devetta. Just going back to the first slide, again, ERS is the Outreach and Technical Assistance Contractor to NYSERDA. We have a little more louder. Okay. Again, NYSERDA as Technical Assistance and Outreach Contractor is ERS. We've been very privileged to have worked with them for 3 years and helping them execute their combined heat and power program. As Devetta said, NYSERDA has been involved in CHP for quite some time, and I'll get into their history in just a minute. But first, just an overview of the presentation today, and after I finish, we hope there might be some questions from the audience, so both Devetta and I will be happy to answer them. As I said, I'm first going to talk a little bit about NYSERDA and what they've done in CHP over the years. Do some overview of what CHP is, what are the benefits, and they are substantial, of CHP. Who else has CHP? What are some of the considerations in considering whether or not CHP is good for your building? and then talk about some actual use cases where CHP might be very useful, especially in combination with other distributed energy technologies, and I'll speak more to that later. So first of all, NYSERDA has done a great amount of work helping the CHP industry get started in New York, going back many years, starting with programs that were somewhat exploratory at the beginning and then refining them as the market evolved to tailor them to the specific needs of where the market was at any point in time. So it started out fairly modestly, but over the years it has grown, and the numbers are increasing, as I will show you in a minute. And to their success, a lot of the metrics on CHP installations show the effect of NYSERDA's participation along with the great efforts of the vendors. The average cost per kilowatt of installed CHP has come down. The cycle time, the time that it takes from project commitment to the time that actually something gets installed, that has come down as well. It's a long process, but that time has been reduced over the years. And most importantly, you'll see on the graph on the right is that the number of installations that NYSERDA has encouraged and helped facilitate has increased dramatically. And those numbers that you see for the most recent year don't even include the much larger number of installations that are in the pipeline. And again, these are some numbers reflecting the results of NYSERDA's efforts over the years, starting out with some fairly modest incentives and investments, but now approaching $100 million of incentives paid to encourage CHP in New York State. The projects are both upstate and downstate. The bulk of them, however, are in New York City, where the benefits of CHP are the strongest. So the multifamily sector in particular is a great beneficiary of combined heat and power technologies. So in affirmation of the effectiveness and the contribution that CHP is making to the state, this is a letter of affirmation from the governor, reaffirming the governor and the state's commitment to continuing NYSERDA's CHP program. So moving along to CHP, so a really basic thing, it's CHP or cogeneration is simply the production, the simultaneous production of electricity and heat, and essentially a generator that makes electricity and then benefits from the heat that it would otherwise be wasted off of the generator. It's been around us for a long time, as Taveta said. This is not a new technology. It's been around for decades and decades. In fact, the largest CHP provider really in the world is Con Edison, in providing electricity and the cast-off heat to the bottom part of Manhattan. Many buildings in New York City actually are participants in Con Ed's large CHP program, which is getting Con Ed's electricity and also benefiting from their steam, which then heats their water and heats their buildings. So we're not talking about big power plants from Con Edison. Instead, we're talking about generators, and these can either be in the form of reciprocating engines, and these engines drive a generator, and then the generator's heat, just like a truck or automobile engine, is recovered and captured instead of putting the heat up outside the exhaust or through the radiator. The heat is captured and put to a useful purpose. The CHP systems can also be in the form of microturbines. Microturbines are little jet engines similar to what might be in a helicopter engine or something like that. Again, a very proven technology, produces the heat, and then the exhaust from the microturbine then heats hot water. So this is another diagram showing a reciprocating engine, CHP. Basically, you have an engine, a natural gas-fired engine in this case, that operates continuously and runs a generator. The generator makes electricity. And then instead of wasting the heat, you take the heat that would otherwise come off the radiator, the engine jacket heat, you put that to use. You also take the exhaust heat, you capture the heat of that in a heat exchanger, and some systems even capture the heat of the lubricating oil. So you can see that with this, you can get a good part of the heat in the form of fuel that's put into it and capture it and put it to good use. So there really are three essential benefits to CHP system. One of the best ones is that it saves money. By producing electricity and heat and hot water at the same time, you avoid wasting the energy from the fuel, as I'll demonstrate in just a minute. The second benefit, which is not necessarily monetizable, but may be equally as important, is that CHP can provide backup power instead of a generator. It can keep your building running in the case of an outage. And finally, CHP is green. Because it uses less energy to provide, less fuel to provide the energy, it produces fewer emissions. So first of all, money. The first benefit, again, when you make electricity and hot water separately, you have a certain efficiency. Power plants, even though they're very sophisticated, operate at a little over 30% efficiency, meaning that almost 70% of the energy that's in the fuel that goes into the power plant gets wasted, goes up the stack, or is lost by condensing steam to feed water. This is something that unfortunately is tied to one of those pesky laws of physics that says you can only get so much out of the energy to make electricity in this configuration. Separately, if you're making hot water or heating your building with a boiler, boilers do a little bit better. If you have a condensing hot water boiler, the efficiency can be in the 90s. If you have a conventional natural gas boiler, like most of your buildings, I presume, do, typically the efficiency is around 80%. But together, the overall energy that you're able to extract from the fuel at the end of the day is only about half of what went in, and that's just a waste of energy. With CHP, since you're able to generate electricity and take advantage of the waste heat that would otherwise be dispelled to the atmosphere, you can take advantage of 80% of the energy that's in the fuel and put it to good use. And that's where the money savings come from. So the second really good benefit, of course, is backup power. If you have a CHP system, it can provide power for the things that you need to keep your building running in the event of an outage. It will likely not power everything in the building. It won't power everyone's unit. But it will be able to keep the boilers running. It will be able to keep your water pumps running so you can get water to the building. It will run an elevator or two or three so you can get people up and down. And it will also provide for common area lighting. These are the things you really need to keep a building habitable in the case of an outage. Now, over the years, if you go back 50 years or go back to, I think, the mid or late 60s when the first big outage occurred in New York, we were all very fortunate, and those outages occurred during temperate months. They've been in the fall months or in the summer months, which might be uncomfortable, but not life-threatening. If we have outages, prolonged outages in the middle of February when the temperatures are 10 or 20 degrees, there are going to be serious problems. So far, knock on wood, we've been very fortunate. But with a serious outage, and Con Ed is very good, they have a very resilient system, but they do happen. Serious outage in the middle of winter could be a significant problem. So this is a picture of Lower Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy, and guess which building had CHP? That picture says 1,000 words. So the third major benefit, and nothing is quite as, I guess, powerful as the first two, powerful as money and resiliency, is greenhouse gas emissions. And because you're burning fuel, less fuel for a given amount of energy, you produce fewer emissions. This is a certificate from the EPA certifying that because of NYSERDA's efforts and the number of CHP installations they have assisted in getting put in, that they have reduced a considerable amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So where is CHP, and where do you find it? Well, of course, you have Con Ed and the power plants, but overall in the state, there are over 600 installations crossing all types of buildings, hospitals, schools, commercial buildings, multifamilies, hotels. There are many hotels throughout the state, and many universities for a long time have had power plants that not only produce electricity but also provide heat to their buildings. We sometimes think of them as power plants, but they are CHP systems. Campuses on universities many are almost entirely powered by central power plants that also provide steam and hot water to the campus buildings. In New York, there are over 150 multifamilies that now have cogeneration systems, and many more in the pipeline. Most of these are in New York City for many good reasons. So what are the keys to having a good CHP system? All buildings are not good candidates for CHP. The main benefit or the main driver of qualification for being a good building for CHP is having a year-round thermal load. CHP makes the most sense when you're able to use the output, all of the output of the system. That means both the electrical output and the thermal output. So if you have a year-round thermal load that can coincide with your electricity demands, that is the best case for combined heat and power. The sizing is very important as well, because if a system is oversized, you're not going to be able to use all of the output, especially the thermal output from the CHP system. So it's very important to work with the vendors and your advisors to install a CHP system of a proper size. And the other thing that is very important is that these systems run 24/7, and they're very robust and they work extremely well, but because they run 24/7, they require periodic maintenance. So because of that, NYSERDA's CHP program has required the approved vendors to enter into a 5-year all-in maintenance contract with the users to ensure that the oil is changed at the right time and the spark plugs and all the good things that you would do with your car are done periodically, so that you can ensure that your system is going to be running and running for many years. So I mentioned before the base load, the fact that you should have a year-round demand for especially thermal energy in order to make a CHP system economical. So here's a graph showing the thermal load of a particular building, and of course the red is the area in which you have a heating load in the winter months, and yes, CHP is very good for supplying heat for heating, but the meat and potatoes of the CHP sizing is in the base load. And that is your domestic hot water load, something you use day in and day out for multifamily buildings. So you typically look to your domestic hot water load to give you a feel for what the size of a system is, because you want as much of that thermal output from the system to be utilized as possible. And then the heating is gravy on top of that. So pardon meat and potatoes and gravy, but that's, so if you can contribute above and beyond that to the heating load of the building, that's all the better. So there are some practical considerations. As I said, not all buildings are perfect fits for CHP. Particularly in lower Manhattan, where you have buildings that have been on Con Ed steam, they don't have boiler rooms and they don't have stacks. So often it's a bit of a challenge to find a place to put the piece of equipment or to vent it, because has to vent someplace. Having said that, it's amazing how creative you can be and find locations outside or wherever that will work. And it's actually quite rare that I've come across buildings that could not be retrofitted just because they were a Con Ed steam building. Often there are things like garbage chutes that aren't being used anymore, or something like a commercial restaurant kitchen exhaust that isn't being used anymore that can be put into use. So just don't dismiss the practicality of CHP if you don't happen to have a boiler room. You do, however, need to have a natural gas supply. This equipment is run on natural gas, so fortunately most of New York's boroughs do have natural gas. In some places they don't, but it can arrive eventually. And of course, because we're supplying hot water to the building for domestic hot water and for heat, you have to be able to tie into the hot water supply of the building, which is usually not a problem. So what are the economics like? Well, simple paybacks tend to be fairly attractive. They're not a 2-year payback, but they're typically the 6 to 8 year range after incentives, or before incentives rather, and lower with incentives. Lifespan can easily be 15 or 20 years if the equipment is maintained properly. I've seen CHP systems that have been operating for 30 years. As these things run, the maintenance contractors will come in and replace parts as necessary, replace whole engine blocks after a couple of years because of the call them millions of miles, or they don't go anywhere, but it's like running your car millions of miles. You just rebuild the thing, and you can keep these things going virtually forever if they're maintained properly. There are a number of options to finance. Of course, outright purchase is the most common way of purchasing. However, a number of the vendors and other financing entities do offer power purchase agreements and leases and some other financial mechanisms. So you don't necessarily have to go out and shell out the capital cost out front, although many people do. NYSERDA does have a very aggressive program for incentivizing the CHP systems, funds systems up to 3 megawatts, provides a custom option for sizes above 1 megawatt. The smaller sizes are typically part of NYSERDA's CHP catalog program. Some years back, NYSERDA took the initiative and is now becoming the sort of the standard for the rest of the industry and the country of compiling and vetting vendors and their systems so that people that apply to the vendors that will use these systems are pre-qualified to be able to get the incentives, provided that the sizing of the system is within the reason. So the vendor is the single point of contact for this, so all the business and the applications go through the vendor. The incentive goes to the vendor, which in turn lowers the cost to the consumer. And there are certain bonus incentives on top of the NYSERDA incentive, which I'll get to in just a minute. The incentives, however, are declining 5% every 6 months, so we encourage anyone that's thinking of getting involved with CHP of doing it sooner rather than later, because that ensures a higher incentive. So the incentives are quite generous. They typically account for about a quarter of the installed cost of a system, although it varies depending on the size of the system or what part of the state you're in. But that is a sort of a rough ballpark idea of what it means to the project costs. There are also additional incentives, which I mentioned before. If the project happens to lie within a Con Ed territory where they are looking to get supplemental power because of some deficiencies that they have in that area, there is an additional 10% added to the incentive. And if it's a critical infrastructure, meaning something like a hospital or a place of shelter, there's also another 10% additional incentive bonus on that. So, as I mentioned before, NYSERDA has adopted or adapted its program to the marketplace and what's happening in it right now. And going forward, starting in 2019, NYSERDA's focus will be not only to take a look at the benefits of CHP to a particular property, but looking at a more of a holistic picture, looking at what other distributed energy technologies might complement CHP and actually have a synergetic effect. So when we will be looking at CHP systems in the future, we'll be looking to see them dovetail and interact with battery storage, with photovoltaic systems, with high efficiency heat pumps, and other distributed energy resources. So this is more of a systems approach now, taking a look at the building as a system and seeing how these different technologies can interact with each other, and by doing so, achieve a greater benefit than they could individually. So I'm going to throw out a couple of examples of some multifamily buildings and show how this synergy or interaction might work. And as you may have noticed, we're calling this now CH Premium, sort of running the two words together. Premium being the additional technology that's added on to the CHP to complement it. So many CHP systems involve one reciprocating unit or one microturbine, and which is great. That may be all they need, but every once in a while a system has to come down for maintenance, or there may be some occasional outages. And when that happens, and when you have only one unit involved, you have there may be a drop in the demand charge savings, because when you have to turn the CHP unit off, now you have the full building load. And so since your monthly demand charges are based on the highest peak demand in that demand window for the month, that means that if the CHP system goes down, you may lose some or occasionally all of that benefit. So to compensate for that, if you added battery storage to your CHP system, you could cover the electrical load in your building when that CHP system had to go down. And that is one example of a synergistic effect of adding two technologies together. For example, this is a sort of a pro forma statement of what the benefits would accrue from installing a 100 kilowatt CHP system in a multifamily, a single unit, on a monthly demand rate. And if you look at the benefits down below, you'll see that the demand savings were 16,000, the kilowatt hour savings were 70,000, and then we have some savings for thermal, and we have some costs of maintenance, and we have some costs for the gas that powers the CHP unit. So if we added a storage system to it, for example, side by side, now we've almost doubled the demand savings and the payback goes down. The other savings remain pretty much the same. You have the same kilowatt hour savings, you have pretty much the same maintenance costs, gas costs are pretty much the same. But what we're doing is we're covering those times when the CHP system was down for maintenance or happened to trip out accidentally. And on top of that, we have a second benefit that the batteries can be used to lower peak demand, especially in the evenings when multifamilies have their highest peak demand. So it covers for the CHP system when it's down, and then the batteries on their own further contribute to lowering demand charge savings. Yes?
Would you mind can you just step through the numbers?
Sure, glad to. So working through the numbers here, we have on the top line is the size in kilowatts of the CHP system. The control strategy in this particular case is thermal following. There are two basic types of control strategies that you can use for CHP systems. You can either run the CHP system to match your hot water load, so it turns down, or if it has to, turns off in order to just meet that thermal load. Or you can do an electrical following strategy, which is you follow the electrical load and you use whatever thermal you can for your thermal needs, and if you have excess thermal, then what you do is dump it through a radiator outside and get rid of it that way. Both have arguments, and there are many control strategies that are hybrids of these two. Our model can look at solar along with this as another distributed technology we can throw into the mix. In this particular case, we're not. And the peakiness factor is a number that we use to describe how bumpy the load curve is. So if it's very peaky, often storage is a very good candidate because we can chop off those peaks with batteries. So demand savings, again, this is resulting, this is the monthly demand charge. This is being able to lower your peak demand during the peak demand windows. We're able to bring it down with the CHP by itself to 16,000. By running the thing on thermal following, we're able to save $70,000 on our electric bill, and the gas costs us about $60,000. We're saving 50 some odd thousand on hot water costs, and we're spending maintenance of $14,000 a year. So the only differences between the two is that on the demand side, on the storage, the installation with the storage, we're getting that much more demand savings. Again, from being able to cover from when your CHP system goes down and being able to use those batteries at times when the peak load is high to chop those peaks down so that you don't have a higher charge on your monthly bill. Your cost, of course, does go up because you have to pay for the batteries. So you have an increased installed cost, but your net annual benefit is such that the payback is actually better with the battery storage than the CHP by itself. So another example, and these are just a few examples, and there are many more, and all of these are site specific, so you have to sort of take a look at a building case by case. But this is an example where, excuse me, you have a direct metered multifamily building where the electricity that the building pays for is only common area, pumps and boilers and lights and that sort of thing. And the shareholders, owners, tenants, whatever they are, pay their own electric bills. So that sometimes results in not the most favorable situation for CHP. Whoops, sorry. Because you're sort of constrained by the electrical load you can deal with. You have plenty of thermal load that the CHP can address, but the electrical load is a little small. That's sort of the opposite of our usual case where you have a sub-meter or master meter building. When the thermal load is usually the controlling factor. You have plenty of uses for your electricity that you can put out, but your thermal load is usually limiting. So, but in the direct metered case, your electrical load constrains you, and so when that's the case, you'll have in Con Ed territory a requirement that you not generate electricity such that you're in danger of exporting it to the grid. One of the requirements in Con Ed territory is that CHP can be used for your own use, but the Con Ed grid network and the feeders are not set up to be able to accept CHP generated power. So Con Ed requires a buffer called minimum import or a minimum forward draw, which is a buffer amount of power to ensure that you're always drawing power from Con Ed. And that further restricts the amount of electricity that you can generate with CHP, and one of the reasons that direct metered buildings sometimes aren't the best candidates. However, if you have a battery storage system and you're approaching this minimum import buffer, you can then use the CHP to deliver electricity and charge the batteries, thereby avoiding that ceiling, and use that stored electricity at a later date when you no longer have that load restriction. So along the similar line, if you have a direct metered building, again with a restricted or lowered electrical load, and you're trying to figure out something to do with that electricity because you have no place to put it, what you can do with it if you have a thermal load is to use a high efficiency heat pump. And the high efficiency heat pump will suck up additional power coming off of the CHP system, so you can run the CHP at a higher rate, and that does two things. That generates more heat off of the engine, and it also, by supplying power to your heat pump, the heat pump's making thermal as well. So if you have a situation where you're stuck because you've hit the ceiling with how much electricity you can pump out, if you have a heat pump in conjunction with it, you can then make heat two ways that can help your thermal load. So that's, these are particular cases, but again, some very valuable combinations that are synergistic. Yes?
In terms of the high efficiency heat pump, can you just delve into that a little bit more? Is that just like a normal?
Yeah, we're talking heat pumps again. There are a lot of advances made in recent years with the efficiency of heat pumps, where they now work much better, for example, in cold climates for heating. I think we're talking here about making hot water, which is actually a softball for a heat pump, because the thermal differentials are such that they perform actually quite well in that environment. If you can happen to be able to use a water source heat pump as opposed to an air source heat pump, the energy efficiencies of the heat pump are even higher. A heat pump is basically just an air conditioner. It's a refrigeration cycle that instead of cooling something down, it's like sticking your air conditioner backwards in your window, and you're basically air conditioning the outside, but your coils on the inside are heating the building up. So it's all it is. It's just a reverse air conditioner. They can work both ways. They can both heat and cool in that regard. So it's pretty simple technology, but the efficiencies of these heat pumps have come up considerably in recent years, and they can be very high efficiency. So the fourth example that I will come up with, I have, is a combination of CHP and PV. PV is excellent. It good source of energy, but it sort of has a mind of its own. That when the sun is out, it makes a certain amount of electricity, and when it's not, it doesn't. So I sort of look at PV as or solar as a load modifier. It helps reduce the building load, but it can do so in sort of funny ways. You get a lot of bumps, and the load sometimes can get quite peaky with solar. And so storage can help smooth that out. But when you have CHP with battery storage, again, in Con Ed territory, you're not able to export CHP-generated electricity to the grid. And if you happen to have photovoltaic generation on site, you might find yourself in a situation where the combination of your CHP and the PV on a nice sunny day, you're going to be up against that ceiling where you're beginning to start to export. So with that, you can throw in some batteries, and then during the middle of the day, charge up those batteries for use later in the day when the sun's not out. And so that's an example where all three technologies can work together quite nicely. You have the CHP, you have the PV, and then the batteries sort of leveling things out for both of them. So, yes?
The Con Ed is buffer. They will not allow you to export any power, correct?
Photovoltaic power can be exported with the right interconnection and agreements and whatever, yes. And CHP, no.
Buffer point. I mean, how much condensate do you always have to draw?
It depends on the size of the building and the load, and that's part of the interconnection negotiations with Con Ed.
What's the high and low?
Oh, again, it can vary all over the place. I mean, I've heard 15 kW at the low side and several hundred on the high side.
What is the percentage of the load?
As percentage of the load? Oh, that's a hard question as well because it's so site specific, but let me put out 10%. Maybe a little less. So I mentioned before that NYSERDA has developed this catalog program where they have vetted vendors and their systems. A quite voluminous catalog. It's available online on NYSERDA's website. If you have trouble sleeping some night, I recommend reading it. No, but it's a very comprehensive inventory of the systems that have been assembled as part of the CHP program. And as part of the program, as I mentioned at the outset, that ERS, my company, is NYSERDA's outreach and technical assistance contractor, and our services are paid for by NYSERDA, and we are really there for the customer, for the potential user. We are there to be their independent advocate to help them explore the potential of CHP, and if it looks good as something they'd like to look into further, we're there for them to help walk them through the NYSERDA incentive process. So we are there to provide customer education, to tell them about CHP. If they are interested in looking into it further, we offer to take a look at their energy usage, either their bills or if they're so fortunate to have interval data on their electrical use, take that and do a high-level computer modeling of the energy contributions and financial contributions of CHP and the other technologies to their building in various combinations. That gives a potential user a very high-level feel for what the potential is, what the paybacks might be, what the IRR might be, and sort of serves as a benchmark for going ahead and getting some further information. We typically walk a customer through the process of inviting approved vendors to come to their properties and give them quotes. And then when they get the quotes in, we help the customer evaluate the various proposals that they might get, help them understand what the terms are, what the assumptions that have gone into the quotations, and try to, as best we can, to do an apples-to-apples type of comparison between vendors. We do not advocate for any particular vendor over another. We're entirely neutral when it comes to that. We have some very good vendors out there with some very good equipment. So it's more of a matter of getting the type of equipment and the size of the equipment that's right for your building. And we will walk, yes. Yes, the vendor would probably be best to answer that.
Thank you. The CHP Premium program has not yet fully been developed. It's the direction we are moving. At NYSERDA, we are right now formulating what will the program terms and conditions be. We will need to work with our counterparts at the Department of Public Service over the next 6 months or so before we actually have an investment plan developed and submit that to DPS for approval. We just know that the direction we're headed is that plain old vanilla CHP, which is a standalone CHP system that New Linson has right now in 2018. As we move into 2019 and the next 4 or 5 years beyond that there will have to be some enhanced capability that brings additional value to the customer. So stay tuned for more information on that.
Probably.
So Michael, Morningside Gardens is investigating an on-site solar installation primarily. This is really interesting. It sounds like they can work together. But the solar definitely will not provide enough for our buildings, loads. So probably getting a battery in times when excess is being produced by the combined system. You'd recommend that, I guess, right?
Again, it's very site specific. We're happy to take a look at your facility and do an evaluation and give you our thoughts on that. And again, they work together in various forms depending on what the load of the building is. But yes, I guess.
Is your next screen your thank you screen? Let him finish real quick because we've got to get to the Q&A.
Yeah, we're close here, and I encourage the questions or whatever. But let me just again, I was talking about ERS's services and that we can be your advocate in evaluating the feasibility and attractiveness of a CHP system, all the way from education, finally up to making a decision. Your board or whatever finally votes on putting in a system. We can walk you all the way there and be at your side. We sort of are at the end again. The 3 best benefits of a CHP system is that it saves money, producing both electricity and hot water at the same time. It's cheaper than the other way around.
Hello, our last seminar of the day will be hot topics for co-ops and condos. Legal updates.
It's good backup power, and it lowers greenhouse gas emissions. So we'd like to entertain additional questions now, both to Veta and myself.
Is your next screen contact?
Yes, contact, right.
I also want to remind you that our booth is right around the corner here, and all of our literature on the combined heat and power program, and also information on our energy storage program, batteries, and the multifamily performance program, which is available for not market rate housing, but affordable housing. That information is over there too. Questions?
In order to entice our board, is there realize after the conversion?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the development. Yeah.
So if you want to entice your board, if you want to be able to sell this internally to your board, is there anything that we can give you? We can give you them to come in and do a presentation.
What kind of savings?
What kind of savings? I think saying that it pays for itself within 4 to 6 years. Oh no, then you have annual savings every year. It depends upon the size of the system. Okay. stop it afterwards and talk to Jim.
Sure.
He can talk to you about what your building size is and give you a general idea.
Yeah, be happy to look into your building and help you
Other
out.
questions? Again, Tecogen is down at the very bottom of the escalator. They're on the right. Aegis is all the way down on the first floor. 2 of our many vendors, please visit them. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Come visit our table.
Thank you.
Thank you.